In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Assalamu alaikum. With the greetings of peace to all of you. On behalf of the Islamic Cultural Center of Northern California, I welcome you to today's debate program and thank you for joining us. These debates aim to broaden and deepen our understanding of religion and religious beliefs and introduce various Muslim and non-Muslim intellectuals, writers, and academicians that work on these issues. The general theme for the first series of these debates is belief and unbelief in a post-secular era. With the advent of technology and internet, the world seems smaller than in the past. However, our hearts and minds seem to have grown farther apart. Hopefully, with these types of programs, we are taking small steps toward bringing our hearts and minds closer together. Today, we are very excited to have two well-known philosophers, Dr. Samuel Fleischacker and Dr. Abdolkarim Soroush, for the debate titled, Can God Speak? Dr. Yaser Mirdamadi will moderate the debate. I thank all those who have worked tirelessly to make this debate possible. Also, we welcome your input and suggestions. Please use the chat to send us your comments or email them to info@iccnc.org. Now, I turn over the debate to the moderator, Dr. Yaser Mirdamadi, who will explain the debate's format and introduce the debaters. Thank you all.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum, everybody, wherever you are. My name is Yaser Mirdamadi, and I'll moderate this debate tonight. This is the second session of the first debate cycle held by the Islamic Cultural Center of Northern California, iccnc. The central theme of the 2022 debate cycle is belief and unbelief in a post-secular era. This session's topic, typically put in a question form, is Can God Speak? To which Samuel Fleischacker provides a positive answer, yes, God can speak, and Abdolkarim Soroush provides a negative response, no, God cannot speak. Before introducing the first debater, let me inform you that there will be a short question and answer part at the end of the debate. If you have any questions, please write them down in the Zoom chat box and send them to us. Please keep it short, to the point, clear, and specify to whom your question is addressed, if not both. The debaters already agreed that Professor Fleischacker would begin the debate. Now let me introduce him. Samuel Fleischacker is a professor of philosophy at the University of Illinois, Chicago. He studied at the Yale University, receiving his Ph.D. in 1989. He works in moral and political philosophy, the history of moral philosophy, and the philosophy of religion. Among the issues that have particularly interested him are the moral status of culture, the nature and history of liberalism, the relationship between moral philosophy and social science, and the relationship between moral and religious values. His publications include The Ethics of Culture, Cornell 1994, A Third Concept of Liberty, Princeton 1999, on Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, A Philosophical Companion, Princeton 2003, A Short History of Distributive Justice, Harvard 2004, Divine Teaching and the Way of the Word, Oxford 2011, and I assume this book is very relevant to our discussion tonight. What is Enlightenment? Routledge 2012, The Good and the Good Book, Oxford 2015, and I assume The Good and the Good Book is a short version of a Divine Teaching book. And Being Me, Being You, Adam Smith and Empathy, Chicago 2019. Professor Fleischacker has been a fellow of the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford, the University Center for Human Values at Princeton, and the Institute for Advanced Study in the Humanities at Edinburgh University. He previously taught at Williams College. Okay, now let us see how Professor Fleischacker, in his 10 minutes opening statement, provide a positive answer to this question, can God speak? So Professor Fleischacker, please.
Thank you very much, Yaser. And thank you all. Thank you to the Center for inviting me to this debate, along with Professor Soroush. It makes me a little nervous to speak in front of him because I've admired him for many years. But I also just want to say I think it is quite wonderful that you have not only these discussions in general, but specifically that you would invite a Jewish philosopher to debate Dr. Soroush. I think this kind of interfaith discussion is particularly important in these days, as you indicated in your opening. So I have to say I don't see my clock, which tells me how much time I have left, but I can look at my own clock up here. Perhaps, Yaser, if you don't mind, when I have 1 minute left, you can raise one finger. Good, thank you. So to begin in a very naive way, I just can't resist saying, on some level, surely those of us who believe in a creator God must say, of course God speaks. When I speak, when Dr. Soroush speaks, when Dr. Mirdamadi speaks, is God not responsible for all of these speeches in some sense? If God is, as those of us who believe in a creator God would say, in some sense, the source of all being, the source of everything that exists, behind everything that really happens, how could God not be, among other things, the source of, the cause of, the reason for our speaking? Now, that's much too simple. It's much too simple for obvious reasons. On the one hand, there doesn't seem to be much room there for human free will. And on the other hand, we certainly don't want to say that all kinds of evil speech, all the many, many evils that are done by way of speech, we don't want to attribute those to God. But, so that raises the question, first of all, of the difference between godly and ungodly speech, let's say. Now, this needn't be, you could bracket the question of whether God is actually speaking. There's certainly supposed to be some speech that is more representative of God, more representative of God's will for us, perhaps, than other speech. There's certain kinds of speech that we want to say tells us more about God or about God wants for us than other speech. As for a Jew, the Torah, the books of Moses will be a prime example of that, the prime example, and for Muslims, of course, the Quran. But if we can say that God is responsible for any speech, if we want to say, as I suggested just now, that God, as the source of everything that is real that happens in our universe, must be in some sense have something to do with, present to or present in everyone who speaks, then surely God is present in the speech that we take to be most godly. Then the question, can God speak, would seem to be answered. Now, what I've actually done is move the question from, does God have something to do with certain kinds of speech, to the question of what kind of speech is rightly attributed to God and what isn't. And that, in fact, that's a very difficult and deep question, a very important question for anyone who believes in a revealed religion. But of course, it's different from the question of whether God can speak. What I'm talking about now would seem to be, I assume Dr. Soroush would say, more a matter of what kind of speech might be attributed to God, what kind of speech might most properly reveal God's ways to us. What I want to say, and I will get back to this soon, is that that speech is rightly held to be the speech of God. But let's just say the speech that most talks to us of what God is like, of what God wants of us, let's call that prophetic speech. I called it godly speech a minute ago. A more traditional name would be prophetic speech. Now, I would like to quote a wonderful theologian on the subject of prophetic speech, on why one might say that prophetic speech is God's speech. This theologian writes, viewing divine discourse as nothing but prophetic discourse is the best way of resolving the theological problems of how God speaks. And in another place, the same theologian says, I am not saying God does not speak. I am saying in order for God to speak, a prophet speaks and his words are considered to be God's words. Exactly, I would say. And now, who is that theologian? It is, as some of you may already know, Dr. Soroush. So that leaves me with the question of, do we actually disagree? Well, one way in which we disagree, and I think it's very subtle, but it may be very important, is that although Dr. Soroush says, as I want to say, that prophetic speech is God's speech, what he more precisely says is his words are considered to be God's words. And elsewhere, Dr. Soroush says, and he's well known for this position, that the attribution of speech to God, like the attribution of other human characteristics to him, is to be taken metaphorically, or says that, or is said to have shown that the Quran is Muhammadan speech rather than divine speech. I don't want to say that prophetic speech is just metaphorically God's speech. I want to say it is literally God's speech. God speaks through human beings. I want to say it's not, I don't want to, obviously I speak more of the Quran than of the Torah, of the Torah than of the Quran. So the Torah is for me the model of what God's speech looks like. I want to say about the Torah that it's not just considered to be God's speech, it is God's speech. And I don't want to say it is Moses' speech rather than God's speech. I want to say Moses' speech is God's speech. Now, why say that? The background to my view is that, first of all, let me back up for a second. First of all, I should say, you might think, speaking of something as God's speech, and then saying, well, this is human speech, which is God's speech. You might say, well, I don't mean that when I say, does God speak? I mean, does God as God speak? Does God as a separable being speak? And that gets one into the question of what God is as a separable being. And there's a long tradition of philosophy and theology in the Jewish as well as the Muslim, as well as the Christian tradition, according to which God as the source of all being must God's self be a being who doesn't have any parts, who is perfectly simple, who never changes because God is perfect. And insofar as God doesn't have parts, therefore doesn't have organs, and insofar as God doesn't change, God can't speak. It's not possible for God to speak. And indeed, in the Jewish tradition, the famous philosopher Moses Maimonides said explicitly, very much like Dr. Soroush, action and speech are figuratively applied to God. God does not literally employ any kind of speech. Well, my starting point in thinking about God, thinking religiously about God, is one on which the kind of metaphysics that tries to work out what God is as a separable being is not possible. That is, I start from Immanuel Kant rather than medieval thought, and I think Immanuel Kant showed quite conclusively that we can no longer maybe not no longer, that we cannot use the categories, the concepts by which we understand our experience in order to understand God. And in that sense, the whole kind of philosophy that tried to think about God as a separable being that dominates medieval thought, that is something that I think it's just not really possible anymore. Maybe never was possible, I should say, or it involves a way of thinking about concepts and categories that we now realize doesn't really work. We can't make sense of God in the terms in which we make sense of natural things. Now, quite explicitly, even Maimonides himself says, existence does not apply to God in the way it applies to other things. Another way to put that, or the way I would put that, is we cannot speak of God as a being at all. If I were to speak of God as a being, then I would have to ask, how does that being speak? And yes, it would follow, on my views as well as Dr. Soroush's, that being couldn't speak. But I don't think of God as a being. I think of God as the source of being. And again, starting from Kant, my reasons for believing in God do start from a moral point of view, a point of view that our ethical world, our way of living in the world, our way of having a good life would not make sense if there were no good being in some sense structuring the universe. But I take leave of Kant, who didn't believe in revealed religion, in saying that God could not provide us with guidance, enable us to live a good life, unless there was some kind of specific guidance of the kind that can only be put into speech, some kind of text or oral discourse, which could help lead us, tell us how to live, help us make decisions about how we should live. And that's precisely what the Torah and the Quran attempt to do. They provide us with a specific vision, a vision that is not purely naturalistic. I think many people like me come to religion when they feel unsatisfied with purely naturalistic ways of living in the world. And in addition, they provide us with a way of living that trumps, that humbles our reason. Thank you, Yaser. And for someone like me, a moral philosopher, it's particularly important to be humbled in my reason and not to think that I have the full truth about things. So in putting my trust in the Torah, as many of you may put your trust in the Quran, I humble my temptation to think that I know everything about how to live. And I also enter into a way of living that at least opens up the possibility that I could have some kind of a personal relationship to God, and God could have some kind of personal relationship to me, could provide me with some kind of guidance. Now, exactly how to make sense of that, I don't know. I do think there's something paradoxical about that. I do also think it's ethically extremely important to attribute certain kinds of speech, like the Torah or the Quran, to God. And I want to say, in attributing it to God, we are saying that God is speaking to us. Not metaphorically, because if it was just a metaphor, what we would mean is we know what it would be for God to speak literally, and the Torah isn't it. Moses speaking or Muhammad speaking, that's not God speaking literally. But I don't know what it means for God to speak literally. So when I attribute the Torah, or you attribute the Quran to God, I think that is a way of saying that God speaks. And I'll just end with one point here, where again, I think Dr. Soroush and I actually come quite closely together, even if we disagree on many philosophical points. I think by attributing the Torah, the Quran to God, by attributing the text to God, we open it up. I've written before, it's an invitation to a fluid, ever-changing process of interpreting the text. If the text was just written by some guy who lived 2,500 years ago, or some scribes and priests who lived something like that, then why should I listen to them? They're human beings who lived a long time ago, or a prophet who lived even 1,000 years ago. If it was written by God, on the other hand, then what it means to me today is constantly in flux. And I think that is powerful, exciting, and ethically worth believing in.
Thank you very much, Professor Fleischacker. If I followed you correctly, my mind was partially somewhere else, taking care of timer, but you provide us at least two reasons for your position. One is metaphysical. If God is everywhere, then God is able to be everywhere, also to have a linguistic presence or representation. And the second reason that you provide for your positive answer to the question, can God speak, was that because of moral reasons, we need to assume that God can speak, because that's the way to make a better sense of the universe and to be guided. Otherwise, Torah or the Quran would be an ancient text like any other text. So let us hear what and how Professor Soroush will provide a negative answer to the question, can God speak, in his 10 minutes opening statement. Professor Abdolkarim Soroush is one of the most influential thinkers of the Muslim world for his analysis of the relationship between religious and secular knowledge and authority. He's a former member of the Academy of Philosophy, Tehran, Iran. As a philosopher, religious reformer, poet, and translator, he has received my recognition from many institutions of higher learning institutions and a lot of attention from the world media. In 2004, he received the Erasmus Award in Amsterdam. In 2008, he was named by Prospect magazine as one of the world's most influential intellectuals. In 2009, based on a public poll, Foreign Policy magazine ranked him number 45 of 100 world's elite intellectuals and global thinkers. Professor Soroush has also taught as a visiting professor at many universities, including Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Columbia, and the Leiden-based International Institute. His diverse interests have led him to examine in his more than 30 books topics such as ethics and human sciences, intellectualism and pietism, religious knowledge, evolution, Rumi's philosophical system, and Persian Sufi poetry. Although most of Soroush's books have been published in Persian, Arabic, and Turkish, he is the author of many essays in English on tolerance, pluralism, Islamic democracy, and comparative philosophy. So the virtual floor is yours for 10 minutes opening statement, please.
Thank you, dear Dr. Yaser and dear Professor Fleischacker. Actually, you reduced the amount of the trouble that I have to take in order to introduce my ideas. Actually, you already said my view about the God speech and can God speak or not. And so I should not repeat what you said on behalf of me. But anyway, let me start my talk in 10 minutes by saying that, first of all, in order to convince the believers that this is not an offensive question, I have to make them sure that there are things that God cannot do. It is not the case that since he's an omniscient and omnipotent, that he can do many things. I can give you some examples, such as, for example, God cannot steal because everything is his. And according to the definition, stealing means to appropriate, other people's belongings. Therefore, you cannot, and God cannot steal anything. God cannot be surprised because being surprised or becoming surprised means that you already did not know something. And then when you suddenly encounter, you will be surprised. So he cannot be sad and many things like that. Therefore, not everything, every characteristic, every attribute that we human beings have can be easily attributed to God. There are things that he can do or he can be, and there are things that he cannot do logically, and out of necessity, he cannot do it. So one of those things is exactly the question of this debate, and that is the speaking. I would like to argue that God cannot, logically cannot speak. And if we attribute the speaking to him, it can only be in a figurative way, in a metaphorical way. And the phrases that Professor Fleischacker actually mentioned here from my books, they are very, very vivid and evident that I have such an idea. Now, why I should, take this position? I think Professor Fleischacker also, this will come in the next round. His literal, meaning of speaking, I think is tantamount to metaphorical way, although I will argue about that, but nevertheless, that's his, spoken position. What I am saying is this: first of all, there are a number of positions about attributes of God. And according to Fleischacker, if we do not have a theology, or if we do not, expose it, quite vividly, we cannot speak about the attributes of God. Let me mention, Professor Fleischacker mentioned Maimonides. I mentioned here Al-Ghazali, who is very well-known theologian, Muslim theologian of the 5th century AH. He says quite explicitly that whatever characteristic and attribute that we, assign to God is metaphorical, period. There is no attribute that is common between man and God, which is literal and objectively in man, that can be, this has got the same sense and the same meaning when we attribute it to God. So that is one position. And I more or less follow the same thing, more or less the same thing. And as you know, Professor Fleischacker mentioned, even some of our philosophers and theologians have gone so far as to say that even the word existence is not attributable or applicable to God, because his existence is different from the human existence. But apart from this business of existence, which is very, very controversial, we might use and consider, for example, science or knowledge. God is knowledgeable, God is omniscient, but his knowledge is not like our knowledge. And because our knowledge is conceptual, is propositional, whereas God's knowledge is not propositional, is not conceptual, because he does not have a mind. And because of that, he is, although we know that he is knowledgeable, he's omniscient, nevertheless, we cannot know how he knows things. And because of this, some of the philosophers have gone to say that, for example, his knowledge is knowledge by presence rather than by concepts. So now this brings me to the main point. If God does not have a mind, if he does not know things through concepts, and if his knowledge is not propositional, therefore he cannot have a language, he cannot use a language, he cannot speak, because all speaking is through words, through concepts, and through propositions. And God does not have the exact, instruments in order to use them and in order to produce a speech in a literal sense. So this is one of the arguments that I would like to put forward, and I think it is very straightforward, and it tells us that in the human world, we can use the word, speech, and we can be called speakers because we have got tongue, we have got mind, we have got concepts, and so on and so forth. Now, the second argument, I put them in a very nutshell in order to be for all of us to be able to follow, and then, of course, to discuss it and debate it. The second argument I would like to put forward is that a speech is a time-consuming thing. I mean, when you speak, you have got first the first word, a sentence, let us say, in a proposition, then your second and third. It is temporal. And God, because he is not temporal, he cannot use in a literal sense the language. He cannot speak. His creation, God is a creator. His creation is all in one go. His creation has never been, continuous and, gradual. Graduality does not apply to God in nothing, not his, neither his, person, if we take him as a person, nor especially in his works, in his, activities, if you like. Therefore, such as we human beings, we use language in a temporal way, and we, bring the second word after the first and the third after the second, and so on and so forth. That cannot apply to God either, because he is not a temporal being. So this is the second argument. The third is exactly, I would say, something which is directly, I would say, directed against Dr. Fleischacker, and that is the case that although God can be considered to be the author of everything, to be the source of everything, to be the creator of everything, nevertheless, this does not give you the warrant to attribute, the attributes of his creation to him. This is very important. I think this is the gist of the matter, the heart of the matter. God creates a speech, and actually God does not do anything except creation. He creates things, but the creator cannot be, called by the attributes of his creations. Let me give you, for example, everything, as Dr. Fleischacker also mentioned, everything is created by God, such as, speeches which people make, and many other things. For example, shame. Shame is created by God, but God cannot be called shameful being. This is because not every attribute that you can find in his creation can be, applied to him. So this is, I think, a fallacy here that, I'm sorry, this is a logical fallacy, I mean, that we think that whatever we find in human beings who's created by God can be attributed to him. God is creator of a speech, but he cannot be called speaker. God is creator of surprise, but you cannot call him a surprised person. God creates laughter. God creates weeping, but he is not a weeper. He is not a laugher. And there are many other things. Therefore, direct speaking is not the creation of a speech. It is something else. And it has got to do with the humanity of human beings, which in God you cannot find it. I think time is pressing, and in order not to trespass my limits, I think I better stop here and listen to Professor Fleischacker for the next round. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Perfect timing. So Professor Soroush actually provides a number of metaphysical problems with the idea that God can speak literally. No, Professor Fleischacker, you have 5 minutes rejoinder, so we'll hear you. Thank you.
So I have to say, we wanted to have a debate here because that's livelier and that's more fun for the audience. But I did think from the beginning that it could well be that Professor Soroush's no and my yes are not really all that different. Because in the end, I certainly want to say yes, but, that is say yes, but I pretty much agree with almost everything that Dr. Soroush just said in some sense of God, literal speaking, the way in which a human being speaks. No, of course, God can't do that. And then I presume, and I think from what I've seen of Dr. Soroush's writings, to some extent, Dr. Soroush also wants to say no, but, in the sense that no, but certain kinds of discourse, certain kinds of speech, above all the Quran for him and for other Muslims, are more revealing of God, more godly, tell us more about God or something like that than other kinds of discourse. And of course, I want to say that about the Torah. Look, my response directly to the metaphysical points that Dr. Soroush has made. First of all, certainly it's true, God can't steal, God can't be surprised. Those were points he made very nicely. Those depend upon certain kinds of conditions, contexts, which it makes no sense to assume that a perfect being, and certainly a perfect being who's the source of the entire universe, could possibly enter into. But if we push these kinds of concerns, and indeed push it along with the medieval philosophers that both Dr. Soroush and I are inspired by, it becomes hard to say that God can even create. If not, God certainly doesn't create in the way we create. That God could be a person rather than a completely abstract idea, the idea of perfection, which we can't really relate to. And certainly would have nothing to do with the Quran or the Torah or any other kind of revealed religion. And my response to that kind of metaphysics as a consequence, not just in Dr. Soroush, but in my own great model philosopher, Maimonides, is if we know that we can't know God's attributes so thoroughly that we can't even say that God exists, properly speaking. We certainly can't say that God knows. Not only does God not know like us, but given that, it's not clear that it's only a metaphorical sense in which we say God knows, in which we say God has power, in which we say God creates, in which we say God's person. If we have to go that far in negative theology, why not also say, how can we know that we don't know this? How can we even know that these negative descriptions of God are accurate? How can we know that this negative theology makes sense? And that's, as I indicated before, why I move from metaphysical theology to ethical theology. And I see this is why, for me, Kant is so inspiring. And actually, I take the Danish Christian philosopher Søren Kierkegaard to be a kind of Kantian also, who's working in the same framework. If we're looking out from what makes sense of a good life for us in the modern world, certainly. It may be necessary, I mean, we believers think it is necessary to posit that somehow the universe is receptive to goodness, shall we say, that there is some good source of the universe, and that's what we call God. And moreover, if we really want to say that in a full voice, then we also, I think, need to say that God somehow has a personal relationship to us. Now, for Christians, including Kierkegaard, that personal relationship takes the form of incarnation. I've seen in preparing for this debate that some people use for Islam the word in liberation. God becomes evident in a book. And that works quite well for Judaism too, because we have a different book, but it's the same idea that God is present in this book. And that's the piece that I really want to hold on to. And to say, hold on to that in full strength, I think, at least in an ethical voice, we need to say the book is God's word. It's not just a human attempt at grasping God's word. It is God's word. And that changes entirely the way we read the book. And that's the sense in which, as I said, we don't differ that much in many ways on metaphysics, but I think that's the sense in which I want to hold on to the claim that God actually speaks, and Dr. Soroush doesn't.
Thank you very much. Actually, Professor Fleischacker emphasized his reason that morally and existentially, we need revelation preferably in the form of divine speech. He also launched an attack against Professor Soroush's argument by kind of slippery slope argument, one might say, that taking a radical apophatic or negative theology would lead us to take the position which is in Islamic theology called ta'til, to, take from God all God's attributes. So let us see in 5 minutes how Professor Soroush provides answer to these critiques. Please, 5 minutes.
Thank you. Well, I don't have any quarrel with Professor Fleischacker that God is so close to us that he has got a personal communication with each one of us. This is absolutely true, not only with prophets, but with every human being. He can have such a relationship, such a direct relationship. But here, actually, we are changing the meaning of a speech. That is what I am, mainly, emphasizing on. Otherwise, for example, when Professor Fleischacker talks about divine speech, he uses the word revelation. Yes, God can reveal himself to us, but this revelation does not necessarily mean speaking. God can communicate with us, but this communication cannot be properly called speaking. God can manifest himself to us, to all human beings. Indeed, he has manifested himself to us and to prophets, but these are a kind of expansion on the meaning of the speaking. And this is exactly the metaphor. So when we use the word, or we claim that God reveals himself to prophet, God communicates with them, God manifests himself, these are all metaphorical meanings for the word speaking. Indeed, in the Quran also, we have got the same thing, and it has been used metaphorically. Perhaps Professor Fleischacker knows, and our friends here, that there is 2 or 3 places in the Quran that says literally that everything is a word of God. Everything is a word of God. And we know that it is quite metaphorical, because the trees and seas and the stars and so on, we do not call them words by any literal meaning, but in a metaphorical sense, yes, everything is a word by God because it manifests God. It reveals the existence of God, the purpose of God in creation, and so on and so forth. In that sense, yes, I know. But let me again, remind you that in the Quran, there is a verse in which mentions the names of so many prophets, including Prophet Muhammad himself, except Moses, and says that we revealed, we sent revelations to them. But at the end said that we spoke to Moses. So the speaking is quite, separated from revealing. This is very important. As if the speaking to Moses was literal, whereas the revelation to other prophets was, again, the speaking of God, but in a metaphorical sense. So I think the revealer of the Quran, be it Prophet Muhammad or God, has been quite, conscious of the problem that you cannot change, revelation for speaking and speaking for revelation. God can reveal himself in many ways and has revealed himself in many ways. But speaking is a particular way that has got a particular meaning in the human sphere. And that is the meaning that we cannot apply to God except in a metaphorical sense and in a metaphorical way. That's why I am saying that in order to solve the metaphysical question of whether God speaks, we have to say that the prophets speak, and this is considered to be the God's speech. Otherwise, if we talk about revelation and so on and so forth, that is literally the case. And God literally reveals himself. God literally communicates with people. God literally manifests himself, and everything is a manifestation of God, and so on and so forth. I mean, whether God is a person or a non-person, all these things are applicable, because revelation by God, by a God who is impersonal, is quite literal. Without, I mean, if he's impersonal or personal, that both can be correct. So that is one thing which I would like to mention. I am in language, I am Wittgensteinian, and it means that speaking means speaking in a human sense. If you want to apply it to God, then you have to peel it off and you have to make it naked, and otherwise nothing will remain at the end of the day, unless you choose a different school in semantics. You choose a different school in semantics, which is non-Wittgensteinian. And that is Al-Ghazali and many others who think and who say that the words are there to nominate the essence of things, rather than the things which we, in the sense that we use it in the human sphere. For example, according to Ghazali, light
Thank you very much.
I'm sorry. Okay.
Just very short. Just conclude your sentence, please.
Light is not necessarily the perceptual light, the visible light. Light is something that enlightens. This is the essence of the word light. Therefore, God can be called light because he enlightens everything. But in a Wittgensteinian sense, no, light is light. In the sense that we use it, I am here using the Wittgenstein's doctrine, rather than Al-Ghazali, who think that names nominate the essence of things. And in that sense, of course, you can expand the meaning of speaking to revelation, to a manifestation, and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We have reached a very interesting part of our debate, which is half an hour, 30 minutes inter-panel discussion. You can call it free debate, which is a more vibrant part of our debate. So if I may put it this way, Dr. Soroush, what will be your answer to that slippery slope argument put against you by Professor Fleischacker, that if God can be depicted in such a way that there are a number of positive arguments, not like stealings, these are negative, these are downsides that cannot be attributed to God, but speech, which is necessary, presumably, for moral guidance, for existential meaning of life, if they cannot be attributed to God, then how can God be God? Then where is the stopping point? What about attributing the attribute of creation, manifestation, revelation, and other attributes? Yeah, please.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I mean, this is a very big question, usually addressed to the people who have via negativa about God. and think that the attributes of human beings and of nature cannot be assigned or applied to God. You see, of course, I mean, God is a mystery. And we cannot, decipher this mystery fully and completely. Therefore, there is always a mystery, something unknown to us about God, about his, person, if you like. And therefore, you may not, expect me to say something which, completely disclose the secret to you and, tells you all about God and demystify him. This is impossible, not only for me, but for the great philosophers, even for prophets themselves, because even the Prophet Muhammad said, we cannot know you the way we should know you, or the way you deserve to be known. Therefore, and again, in the Quran, we have got the verse that asked for the increase of your knowledge. So even the prophet means and says quite humbly that I do not know much about God. Therefore, I ask him to teach me more and more and more. So that is the way we have to, tells us that we have to be very humble when we talk about God, when we attribute something to him. And because of our limitations, and because of the limitations of language, because of the limitations of knowledge and everything. But then, I have got a positive answer here. That's according to all metaphysics. I mean, Jewish, Islamic, and Christian. God is absolutely perfect and the source of all perfections. So whatever there is a perfection, if we agree upon it, it can be applied to God and can be assigned to him. If knowledge is a perfection, if power is a perfection, therefore no doubt that God is powerful, God is knowledgeable, omniscient, and so on and so on, in his own way, Always we have to add this proviso that in his own way. And this is actually the way that all philosophers use it, كما يليق بجنابه, as he deserves it, as is applicable to him. And without this, we cannot, be absolutely correct about him. Therefore, I think on the one hand, we know that he's the most perfect being, and all perfections are due to him, come from him, emerges from him. And on the other hand, we know that we cannot talk much about it. Here, actually, two things must be separated from each other. Whether God is the source of all perfections, whether God actually has all perfections, in the one hand, yes, he is. But on the other hand, how much we can talk about it, how much we can conceptualize it. The conceptualization, of course, is always defective, always deficient, and we cannot be 100% sure that we have got a perfect description of the perfectness of God. Therefore, the separation should be made here between the over-conceptualization and, putting it into language, and on the other hand, the perfection of God himself.
Yaser, do you want to ask me a specific question, or should I respond to things that...
Yeah, please, go ahead. Yes, please.
So I have some thoughts about what Dr. Soroush just said, but I'd like to go back to his rebuttal statement a bit. And we're not going to be able to settle this completely here, I think, but I want to think about what it means to say that speech is metaphorical. In some sense, if speech requires a vocal cord and tongue and so forth, then no, God can't speak, but neither could Stephen Hawking, nor neither can a deaf person. A deaf person may speak, in quotes, you could say, by using their hands, saying, right? And sometimes I will say, well, maybe I spoke to Yaser yesterday, meaning I emailed him and he emailed me. Today we use it that way. And in fact, it was funny, again, we may be too close for a real debate here. I'm a Wittgensteinian. That's very one of my orientations in philosophy. And I think, therefore, of words, the meaning of words is given by their various contexts, and I stress the S, the plural, language games, as he would say, again in the plural, of their use, which is to say, words mostly, very often, have different meanings in different contexts, used in different language games. So until very recently, I don't think we would have said, I talked to somebody when we meant I wrote something by email, but or by text. But by now, that's become so familiar. It is a new, I think, quite legitimate language game. And I think if a deaf person uses sign language, we quite straightforwardly say that they're speaking. In that sense, if God in some sense communicates, and I still do want to ask how the absolutely perfect being that Dr. Soroush characterizes God as being, how that being could communicate, because that's also a change, it takes place gradually, issues about that. But let's just say we agree God somehow communicates, manifests God's self. Why should that not be one of the language games in which we can describe God as speaking? I guess I would be inclined to say, and this may just be a semantic difference in a not interesting sense, but I would say that, if you, Dr. Soroush, or Yaser, or Ali says something to me that seems very wise, and it helps me a lot in guiding my life, I might say, oh, it's if I've heard from God. I mean, it would seem a little bit blasphemous, but I might say, oh, yeah, it's like your lips are speaking the words of God or something. But I'd mean that metaphorically, as opposed to when I read the Torah. What's the difference? I treat the words of Torah as above me, as something I have to interpret rather than change. I treat your words, however wise, as something that I incorporate into my own reasoning. So in that sense, I'd want to say your words might only metaphorically be God's, while Moses's words, Muhammad's words, are literally God's. What I want to stress right now, and what I'm curious about your reaction to, is why not say it's God's speech if it is any kind of God's communication, given that we already use speech in the Wittgensteinian way that you and I both accept in many different ways? Why not say when we're talking about God's communication, that's speech, even if it doesn't come through sound?
Well, that is exactly what I call it metaphorical. I mean, the same slippery slope that you put to me about the attributes of God and the via negativa, it applies to you now, because you are actually, to some extent, are blurring the borderline of the metaphor and the literal meaning. Virtually, by expanding the meaning of speaking and applying it to communication and the rest, virtually you are telling me, and I quite agree with you, but you would like to call it literal, and I would like to call it metaphorical. Here is a little bit, I'm not sure if it is just a debate on words or on the real thing, because I don't have any disagreement over the issues that God can communicate, God can manifest himself, God can, in your sense, can speak. But that, I think, in a Wittgensteinian sense, cannot be called speaking. For example, if you go back to the debates between, very well now that the Ash'aris and Mu'tazilis in the Islamic traditional schools of theology, their debate over whether God can speak or not exactly, was about this point, that the literal meaning of speaking cannot be attributed to God. Whereas when you expand the meaning and you take everything as the word of God, then of course, everything is a speech of God and tells us something, and we can, draw some meaning out of it. For example, when you look at stars in the sky, you might say that the stars are talking to me. You might call this as a literal speech. I cannot. And so here, as I said, the boundaries are blurred here. And that's how
Look,
Yeah.
you might be right that we're only differing in words. That's why I said this might be semantic difference in an uninteresting way. You want to call it metaphor, I call it literal. There's not that much different. But I mean, and maybe we should get off this.
Sorry, your literal is my metaphor. I mean,
Yes,
so
yes,
my
right,
metaphor
right.
is not your literal.
But let me just quickly, one of the things I just asked you, would you say that deaf people using sign language are speaking, or that when we use texts or emails that's speaking, or do you want to say literal speaking doesn't include that either?
Oh, it depends. It depends on the convention of the speakers of the language. If that convention actually is well spread and well accepted by the speakers of the language, then of course it would be a literal meaning of the word. Otherwise,
Then why can't there be conventions according to which, if a piece of discourse is supposed to be absolute and beyond us, revealed, then that we call that God speaking?
Oh, yes. So then you are bringing the semantic view that the words are there for the essence of meanings rather than for the things. You said the essence of speaking is communication. The essence of speaking is manifestation. And therefore, somebody who does not have the chords and can speak through instrument, then he is really speaking because the essence of speaking is there. Here, you are not a Wittgensteinian.
No,
Here,
but I'm saying the conventions that we use, and this is Wittgensteinian, in a particular language game could be such that we call that speaking. Not because that is to say, because it resembles, because that kind of communication resembles what goes on when you and I speak. Some people might say, okay, that's a perfectly fine language game. We'll call that God's speech. What would be wrong with that?
Well, I would say that it's a new convention. In the past, you did not have such a convention. In the past, you did not have such a convention, and therefore the debate was a real debate.
Yeah, sorry, can I interfere? Yeah, Professor, can you interfere? Yeah. Because, you know, at the beginning, you said that there is a metaphysical problems, and now the problems comes down to a kind of different conventions. How do you characterize that? Are
you asking me or
yes,
him?
yes,
You're asking me? Yes, it is a metaphysical, but it has got a semantic, aspect as well. Now we are, in a slippery slope, if you like. Now we are on the ground of semantics. Exactly, this is where I would like to clarify, over differences. If you think, Professor Fleischacker uses the different language games, which is quite okay. I don't have any quarrel with that, but these are human conventions. And such a convention did not exist in the past. Such a convention, unless you take resort in the essential meaning of the word. You say, okay, using any symbol in order to communicate means speaking. And I think this is your position now. And this, I take it as metaphorical. I mean, you may name it as a language game, a different language game, that doesn't, change the essence of the question. Am I, yeah.
I see what you're saying. I mean, look, I was appealing to new language games myself, texting, email, and so forth.
Yes.
And maybe we need new theological language games. But let me just go back for a second, because I found it very interesting, to the Quranic verse you cited. There is a bit of a parallel in the Torah, in that it says about Moses, God spoke to all other prophets, through a dream or a vision, but spoke to Moses face to face. So it's a little bit different, but there's certainly a notion that the communication is different to Moses, right? And more direct, whatever that means. Now, in the Middle Ages, again, I'll turn to Maimonides. He's not the only one who says this, though, but in Jewish thought, he's probably the best figure, partly because he engaged with Muslim theologians so much. He doesn't seem to have believed literally that God speaks at all. I was quoting him before, saying very much what you say. Only figuratively can we say that God speaks. So he looks at the verse It says God spoke to Moses directly, face to face. What does he do with it? Well, in the famous passage in his commentary on the Mishnah, which is about the prophecy to Moses, he says, first of all, he says in a metaphorical way, God spoke. That may be directed at a popular audience who would be too upset if he said God didn't speak. But what it translates into in the sort of lengthy commentary is that we are to take the words of the Torah, every single one, and he quotes some of the most banal, seemingly empty lines, and says we have to look in them for, as it's translated, the wisdom and the wonders it may contain. That is the divine wisdom it may contain. So I'd suggest that he does already have a nascent sense of a different language game in which to say something is God's speech means it has to be taken extremely seriously and has to be taken as wisdom beyond the human, rather than anything literally like. So that's to say, the language game I'm talking about may not be totally new.
Well, okay, that's a good example. Let me remind you, of course, you need not a reminder that in the case of Moses, the burning bush was speaking to Moses. So it was not that direct. Still, right. It was indirect, okay? So if you would like to call an indirect communication a direct speech, then it's up to you. But I don't think that it is a direct speech. It was indirect. Yes, for other prophets, of course, and this is very explicitly said in the Torah, that God spoke to them through their dreams, all right? So this is very explicit that it was a dreaming, which is called God's speech. And that is, again, metaphorical. But in the case of the Moses, of course, it was an indirect. I don't disagree with the indirect speech of God. I do not disagree with the metaphorical speech of God. Here we are actually talking about the direct, literal speaking of God. You know, your policy and your strategy actually is to expand on the meaning of speaking, on the meaning of speech. This expanding is not actually, your way is not just to bring in the essence of the meaning, but the language games. But I would say that they come more or less to the same thing. And you are actually, by expansion, you bring in, perhaps here is a little bit Donald's, who is this philosopher, British philosopher, who talks about metaphors.
Davidson.
Yes. Maybe this is a little bit close to his position about metaphors. That, but anyway, as I said, maybe my meaning of speaking is a little bit too narrow. And your meaning of speaking is a little bit too vast. But you have to find a middle way here, a middle position here to bring it together and to make us closer to each other. Yes.
Yeah.
But still, I think that if speaking means using words and propositions and statements, in this particular sense, God does not speak. I think you are with me, or not?
I am very reluctant to say what God doesn't do literally. All literal language about God, I think, is problematic, and that actually we agree. But that makes it that means that I certainly would not affirm that God uses words. I don't know whether I would also affirm that God doesn't use words. Both statements seem to me to be going too far. Look,
sorry, God can create words. God can create words. That is not problematic. But in that sense,
why is that not problematic?
No. Let us take it as unproblematic. Let us, assume that it is unproblematic. Still, he cannot be called a speaker. You know, even if he is able to create words, to create language, to create concepts, but in that sense, he is not a speaker. But a speaker is something which, the meaning of the speaker is bound to some conditions and context which is not provided for God.
Let me just suggest two directions that I think I'd like to see us go. and Yaser, feel free to come in if you want us to go in a different direction. One direction is, on the one hand, I still want to press you on why you are willing to grant me. Of course, I'm happy you granted to me that God can communicate and God can create, because it seems to me that God is an all-perfect being. Those should be problematic for you too, because God can't change, and therefore can God do something like creation or communication that takes place in time. The other direction is, I think I need to explain a little bit more why I have the more expansive conception of divine speech. And I'll say, I'm happy to say something about that. But if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to ask you first, why do you make this concession to me that God can communicate and God can create?
Yes, God can communicate, God can manifest himself, and this does not necessarily means that God can change, because in the case of God, he is not temporal, he's eternal. And all these things are taking place in eternality, in a non-temporal, sphere of being. Therefore, there is no change. All change happens in the temporal sphere of being, and God does not. The temporality does not apply to him. Therefore, it doesn't make any change to him. Because change and time, they are, hand in glove, and they go hand in hand. And according to, of course, the metaphysicians, Muslim metaphysicians, time is an offspring of change. Where there is no change, there would be no time. Where there is no time, it means that there is no change. So they are hand in hand, going together. And God, in his timelessness, does not change and cannot change.
So I think that is quite beautiful. And also, I know there's a parallel to that view in Maimonides also, so I like that. But may I suggest that since in ordinary human speech, in ordinary human language games, manifestation takes place in time, communication takes place in time, shouldn't you want to say that God only metaphorically creates and only metaphorically communicates and only metaphorically manifests himself?
No. Why should we say that creation should take place in time? Because time, creation is before time, temporality. Temporality itself is one of the created things. Time is created.
Okay.
Therefore, creation is not subject to temporality.
And the same for manifestation and communication?
Yes, indeed. Yes, the same for that.
If because we have around 7 minutes of free debate, if I ask a very quick question from Professor Fleischacker first, the emphasis of your reasoning for the idea that God can speak is moral and existential. And I was wondering if that leads your position towards a kind of pragmatic argument for the possibility of divine speech. And one might wonder, do you take it, or do you consider it as a kind of epistemic argument? Because if it is purely pragmatic, so the epistemic likelihood of the truth of divine speech is not established. Or you might say it's moral and existential, but if you're moral realist, which I don't know if you are, then it at the same time pragmatic, and it also has epistemic value for the position. So very quickly, how do you characterize your argument?
Good. Let me try to answer that in two different ways. First of all, in some sense, yes, it's in my position you could characterize as a pragmatic one, certainly as an ethical one, in the sense that, and this is what I was going to say before, if I expanded on why I have the expansive notion of divine speech. I'm mostly arguing with other Jewish theologians who want to say that the Torah and a fortiori all other Jewish prophetic writings are just human, and they're attempts by human beings to understand God. They are not divine. And that allows us today to rewrite them, to take the parts we like and not take the parts we don't like. And I think down that road goes the end of any revealed religion, certainly of Judaism. I think it's very important to hold these above us as something we have to struggle to find their true meaning for, rather than to rewrite them with our own reason. And that is to say, I'm pushing one kind of language game about these texts, as it were, against another. And I push it for ethical reasons, ethical / theological reasons, that is, at least ethical / religious reasons that have to do with what the religion would look like, I think, if we just say, oh, it's only human. But to say that this argument is pragmatic, it serves ethical purpose, opposed to metaphysical, that suggests that I have a metaphysical view by which I know what it would be for God literally to speak, and the Torah isn't that. Or I know what it would be for God literally to speak, and I know that God cannot do that. That, I have to say, does seem to be Dr. Soroush's position, and that's a position that relies on a much more substantial metaphysics than I am willing to accept. That's to say, I mean, coming out of my Kantian heritage here, I don't, and Wittgensteinian, I don't think we can settle those kinds of questions. So at least, let's put it just in my own personal terms, I have no such metaphysics. It's not like I know what the literal meaning of God speaking would be, and I have to say that's not possible, and then I'm just pushing a notion of God speaking because it's useful. No, I'm saying I have no idea what God speaking could possibly mean, other than attributing certain kinds of human discourse to a divine source, saying when Moses spoke, it wasn't Moses. It really comes, it's transformed into the word of God, and we must treat it that way. And in saying that, it's not like there's a contrast that I'm hiding, as it were. This is fully what I believe. The ethical claim that I'm pushing is, I think, I also would argue, the only way of making good sense of what it is for God to speak.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Professor Soroush, I also have one question. Is it fair to say that according to your theory of divine speech, there is no such a thing as a special revelation? Of course, according to your position, general revelation, manifestation of God in knowledge, in creation, in beauty, in art, in everything, in the good, is of course possible and even actual. But what about special revelation? What about like me talking to you in private rather than me, publishing a book and you read it? So in this case, I'm God, you are the prophet. So
yes, yeah. And a special revelation, I mean, it's quite simple. A special revelation means a special dreaming. You have got your own dreams, I've got my own dreams. So this can be a special revelation to me, not to you, and yours is yours, not me. So inspirations, such as, for example, you have got some inspirations that I do not have, and vice versa. So it means, for example, Prophet Muhammad had some inspirations, and he was, again, in order to make my position closer to Professor Fleischacker, first of all, a very small question. Do you think that the burning bush was God who talked to Moses? Because you always using, for example, a prophet, when Muhammad speaks, when Moses speaks, it's God himself who is speaking to us. Okay, I mean, suppose that this is the case. What about the burning bush? Is that still the case for you? I mean, it was the words of God coming from the burning bush, or there you might have a different position. So this is one, my question. But then I have got a comment here on what you said. Yes, in Islamic Sufism, they actually say more or less the same thing as you say, but of course, in on the basis of some very different metaphysical foundations. They say, for example, Al-Hallaj, whom you know probably, and he was one of the great Sufis who was hanged because of his declarations. And one of the sayings that he said, and because of that he was accused and then executed, was, "I am God." He said this repeatedly, and he was considered as an apostate and who deserved execution. Now the defenders of his position, later Sufis, came exactly to the same position as you mentioned. Of course, yours is very much more expansive. They said he was not Al-Hallaj who said, I am God. At that moment, God was saying, I am God. God was saying through him, I am God. You see? So there is such a position. This is actually my position. My position when I say that the prophet is imbued with God, with divinity, when he talks, you know, when he tells us that he is now telling us and reciting us the revelations that come to him, because God is not outside him. God is with him. And
we are running.
I mean,
sorry to interrupt. You're running out of time.
Most of the time, people think that God is there, and then he communicates to us. Whereas when we change, you know, this view, and God is with us, God as us, and God is inside us. Therefore, there is no much difference between the outside and inside. And then when the prophet speaks, God is speaking directly to us.
Yeah, Professor Fleischacker, very, very short answer, please, because we're running out of free time. Please.
Oh, no, I can incorporate anything further I want to say into the final speech. Go ahead, straight to that.
Yeah, okay. If that is the case, thank you very much. So we have reached the end of our interpanel or free debate. No, Professor Fleischacker, you have 5 minutes for your concluding statement. Please.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I found the exchange back and forth very valuable. And I would also say, as we've known from before, our positions are not that far apart. Let me say something a bit about the burning bush, because I think it's a very nice example. Obviously, I have no idea what happened there, if anything happened, if it's based on anything, but there's a wonderful, wonderful opera by the great Jewish composer Arnold Schoenberg called Moses and Aaron. And it begins with the burning bush. And in his picture of it, Moses is sitting there looking at some burning bush, and he's thinking, inconceivable, perfect, wonderful, incommensurable being. Schoenberg has him utter almost incomprehensible metaphysical words in response. Well, that's not a bad picture. I could, if I try to make sense of it in a more or less naturalistic way, I can easily imagine there was some kind of shocking, surprising moment. Maybe Moses was looking at a bush that was surprisingly burning without seeming to get burned up. That's the language there. And it leads him into some thoughts about God. And those thoughts might be the beginning of a mission. And perhaps what we want to say is that the thoughts, as recounted in the Torah, they are the thoughts that lead him to take on the mission of saving his people from slavery, that those are actually God entering into him in some form. There's a passage early in the Torah, which is read by Jewish mystics the same way. Jacob has a dream, he wakes up and he says, literally, if you translate from the Hebrew, because there's an unnecessary repetition of the first person, God was in the place and I knew it not. So the mystics say, I did not know my I. A different speaker entered into me. So basically God spoke through me. That's a way of making sense of it. The thing is, somewhat to my surprise, Dr. Soroush and I fully agree that God can communicate, although I want to say that in some sense that has to take place in time, and Dr. Soroush doesn't want to say that, and that probably is a very important metaphysical difference. Ethically, and remember that's the framework through which I come to this, that is, I come to it through religious ethics rather than religious metaphysics. I want to say that the difference between us is not great as regards the status of our divine texts. That is what Dr. Soroush is not saying, which some of my fellow Jewish theologians do say, is not saying that the Quran is not in some sense a manifestation of God or the word of God. I do think probably he takes it to be more fluid than I take the Torah to be, but that's a matter of degree. Both of us see the prophetic word as beyond ordinary human words, not something to be reduced to ordinary human words. And that's the impact of my saying, the implication, the main implication of my saying that God speaks. To say that the Torah is spoken by God and possibly other texts to other people. My own view is the Torah is spoken by God to the Jewish people. It's God's speech to the Jewish people. There may be other speeches to other people, but that's to say there are texts, discourses that are divine in the sense that they have divine wisdom. They are rightly attributed to God and not just to ordinary human thinking. That's supposed to be the upshot of my claim that God speaks. Now, on the metaphysical level, I don't know that that leads me to disagree that much with Dr. Soroush, and in fact, we might characterize episodes like the burning bush, like later passages in the Torah in which it says God speaks to Moses, in a similar way. These might be natural events that in some sense, surprising natural events perhaps, ones that shake up an ordinary human being, in some sense are taken to occasion an awakening of godly thoughts that you don't have in other occasions. And in that sense, is it literally God speaking? Well, I want to say that. Dr. Soroush wants to say it's metaphorical. I don't know that that difference is so great. Especially if we can agree, and this is the main thing that I want to emphasize, that in the end, the speech is beyond the level of ordinary human wisdom, that it's a kind of wisdom above us, I want to say divine wisdom, that we have to wrestle with rather than simply translate as more of the same thinking that we can do on our own.
Thank you very much. Okay, so let us hear the 5 minutes concluding remark of Professor Soroush before going to the Q&A, please.
Yeah, well, again, I don't have much to say or much to add. I mean, Professor Fleischacker's words and what he was quite clear about his ideas. I would like to add some comments here and bring to your attention. First of all, in the case of Moses, it's very important, and I have always thought about this difference between what is there in the Quran and in the Torah. In the Torah, as all of us know very well, when Moses asked God, "Who are you, who you are speaking to me?" And the answer of God is, "I am who I am." Okay, here in Hebrew. I am who I am. He did not use any concept. He did not use any concept. He said only as if he were a pure being. I am pure being. I am who I am. I cannot, call myself what I am. I am what I am. But in the case, exactly the same question you have in the Quran, and God to Moses does, according to the Prophet Muhammad, not say, I am who I am. He says, I am the creator of the world, Rabbul Alameen. I am the creator of the world. This is a difference which we have to bear in mind, and which is very important, that the revelation to Moses was perhaps different from the revelation to Muhammad, because his was conceptual, linguistic, whereas the Moses to whom God spoke directly, supposedly, did not use any concept. So this means that there is a difference between two, and that difference actually comes up in the Quranic verse that God had revealed himself to all prophets, including Muhammad, except Moses, to whom he spoke directly. This means to whom he spoke not conceptually, that in a way that is beyond conceptualization. So that's one thing. The second thing is, I'd like to say from Ibn Arabi, who was perhaps by far the greatest mystic in the Islamic world, Islamic tradition. He says something which goes to what Professor Fleischacker, he says, when you are reading the Quran, sometimes you feel that the verse is directly speaking to you. Sometimes you feel, this is the revelation of God to you. God there is revealing himself to you. You feel that you are the addressee of the verse. And this is exactly the revelation, he says. And this is exactly the speech of God. And that has got pragmatic values, as you might, and ethical values. And When you say that the speech of God is something which is beyond me, which I have to submit myself to it, which I have to think that it is coming to enlighten my reason, something which perhaps I do not understand, this is exactly what Rumi says, again, one of the great mystics in Persian. And he says, it is surprising, it is very surprising. Therefore, it's come from heavens, because everything human is ordinary. And this is eternally surprising. So, qaribas. So all these things come close to what you say, but nevertheless, I think, for example, Rumi was on the side of the Ash'aris who thought that the speech of God is eternal, and none of them actually were on this side of Mu'tazilites. I don't have much to add. I think the debate now is being concluded in a good way, and we are waiting for the floor to perhaps to hear their questions.
Yeah, okay. So we have, thank you very much, both Professor Fleischacker and Professor Soroush. So let me begin Q&A, if I may, with a question that I myself have from Dr. Soroush. As you have seen, the main emphasis of Professor Fleischacker was axiological value theory. It's valuable for our moral and existential Weltanschauung, our meaning that God talks to us. Do you agree, Professor Soroush, that axiologically, putting all these metaphysical supposedly problems aside, axiologically, do you agree that the direct speech of God would add significantly to our human life, to our value, I mean, regardless of, as I said, metaphysical problems?
Well, I think there is not much difference between my position and Professor Fleischacker's position when it comes to the axiology, when it comes to the values. And the metaphorical, position, I think, has got an extra value, a surplus value, and both for the Jewish religion and for Muslims, because most of what is there in Quran and in the prophetic tradition about the law, my position is that all this comes from the prophet. And this does not come directly from God, and it has got all kind of conditionings, temporal conditionings, and the way the prophet himself lived, and the society, and the culture, and the language, and everything. And because of that, actually, I do not make it eternal. I do not make it in such a way that it is a divine, eternally has come to us in order to be eternally applied in the life of people. So I think this is the surplus value of the metaphorical position of the speech of God. When you say that it's a speech of the prophet considered to be the speech of God, it means that already a kind of humanness is embedded in the speech. It is not purely divine. Whereas when you take it as purely divine, then solving these kind of problems will become formidable.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I have to mention that a number of questions put to us got answered already by the debater throughout the debate, but here are some questions. What is, which this one is addressed to both of you, please. What is your definition of God? Specifically, do you consider God to be personal or impersonal? Professor Fleischacker, you first, if I may ask you, please.
Sure. The problems that Professor Soroush and I agree we have in talking about God make any kind of definition of God essentially provisional and I would say metaphorical. It's a very difficult question to answer. I like to use the phrase, God is the all-good creator of the universe. I prefer all good to perfect because perfect being is the standard philosophical answer. That implies all kinds of metaphysical claims about God having perfect knowledge, perfect power, some say perfectly free, also perfectly benevolent, and cashing those out I find extremely difficult. I think all good, because it's vaguer, is actually preferable. But I add creator of the universe because there is a notion of God as a sort of being independent of the universe, a sort of Aristotelian being that's always there and doesn't shape our lives at all. That either or I hold that, and I think it's hard to hold that view of God and remain a specifically Jewish, Christian, or Muslim believer. I think one has to hold minimally that God is the source of the beings of this universe. So I say all God, all good creator of the universe.
Thank you very much. Professor Soroush, you please.
Well, I think since you mentioned this impersonal God, I would like to say that the language of religions, I mean, not only Christianity, which is very explicit and that, but also in Judaism and in Islam, the language of the religion, the text, the scripture, tells us that God is very personal, actually. And he has got all, human attributes, such as anger, such as, benevolence, such as mercy, and so on and so forth. And because of that, most of the people actually worship a personal God. But if you, go beyond that, of course, philosophically speaking and mystically speaking, God cannot be a person. And so he's impersonal. Even the word he or she does not apply to him, but it's always a limitation of the language. You have to use a pronoun for him. And of course, it has got some relationship with power, maybe. So as the modern philosophers would like to say. So yes, God is personal in the ordinary language of religions, but mystically, philosophically speaking, he is impersonal and he is pure being, a formless being with all perfections. So that is, let us say, my definition of the undefinable.
Okay, I have to admit that it's very difficult to succumb this temptation not to actually ask further, because any and every point that you make actually leads to quite another interesting point. But let's go further. What is the relationship between God's speech and other ways of God's communication with humans, like revelation, epiphany, inspiration? Yeah.
Well, yes, please.
Go ahead if you want, Dr. Soroush.
No, please.
It is not specified to whom it is addressed. That's why I'm also silent.
I'll just quickly say, for me, it's not, I don't actually want to say that all of these terms mean the same thing. I especially hold off inspiration because in the Jewish tradition, often inspiration is contrasted with revelation. It's considered to be a lower standard, a lesser level of enlightenment by God, let's say. But I do think here the Wittgensteinian thing comes in again. There are different language games of using these terms, in some of which they are virtually identical and others they're quite different. In the way I use the terms, God's communicating, God's revealing God's self, and God's speaking are pretty much identical. I certainly don't think there's a kind of God's speech that isn't by way of this revelation. I guess I would say that I use speech partly because it means that somehow whatever one receives from God or understands of God can take propositional form. And that means it can take, among other things, the form of commandments or laws. And in that sense, it's interesting to me, in my tradition, Dr. Soroush would be more of a Reform Jew than I am, to my left theologically. I do want to hold on to the sense that in some sense, although we agree that our sacred texts need to be fluid and need to be reinterpreted, in some sense, the Torah remains valid to this day. And it remains valid as a form of discourse, of speech, and simultaneously communication from God, manifestation of God, revelation.
Yeah, we have only around 7 minutes time. So this is addressed to Dr. Soroush. How do you explain? Okay, language is, it is not addressed to Professor Soroush, but I think it should be. language is a human convention. Does God use that? Does God follow humans in their language, grammar, words and structure, and their semantics? If I wanted to radicalize the question, if I may, a little bit more, Dr. Soroush, what's wrong with God using human convention to convey his or her meaning?
There is nothing wrong with that. There is nothing wrong with that. And actually he does it. But I repeatedly said this, that in that sense, he cannot be called a speaker. He is a producer of speech. He is a creator of words, but a creator of word cannot be called, properly speaking, a speaker. So that is my position. God can, for example, in your dream, let us say, somehow talks to you through words and propositions and so on. But this is the creation of him. It is not speaking. On the other hand, God cannot have a private language. And these are, again, the limitations that God has to submit himself to. When God would like to speak to us, he should use the language, and he should observe the grammar of the language. And because of that, all revelations has got their limitations. Because when God speaks in Arabic, he can conceptualize things which cannot be conceptualized in Greek, for example, or in English, and so on and so forth. So these are logical limitations, which, if you like, can be, you might say that can be applied to God. But in my sense, all these limitations are being applied to the prophet, not to the God himself.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you
And
very
this
much.
is one of the differences between the metaphorical sense of speaking and the real sense of the speaking. Yes.
Thank you very much. So the next question is addressed to Professor Fleischacker. In a sense, I asked this question, but due to the significance of this question, let me ask it again. He gave, Professor Fleischacker gave a pragmatic and utilitarian argument for attributing the speech of prophets as a speech of God. Russell's advice was to look for the truth, not the pragmatic values. What is Professor Fleischacker's reaction to this Russell's advice?
So I should say I resist being called utilitarian at any time. I was a teenage utilitarian, and then I grew up. I'm certainly not talking about an ethics that is designed to maximize human pleasures or something like that. So to say that something serves ethical purposes does not mean to me that it is simply to serve purely humanistic ethical purposes. It's to say it's, in some broad sense, it enriches our lives. It helps us approximate, come closer to the good of our lives, approximate the good, and where goodness is mysterious. And I think that's part of what it is to see goodness as God or as given by God. Precisely, there's a mystery to be uncovered here. However, all that said, I am giving what you might call ethical rather than metaphysical reasons for talking about certain kinds of discourse as God's word. But I take that itself to be a realist move. That is, I take it that in the realm of theology and in the realm of ethics generally, to say something is, I don't want to just say useful, because that makes it look too utilitarian. To say something is ethically important, has ethical value, is itself to say that it is true ethically. That's what it is to make a claim to ethical truth. Ethics is not like science. We don't test the statements that we make by observation. We don't derive them from logical propositions. And I don't think we derive them from metaphysical propositions either. So in saying that the Torah, and if you like the Quran too, and maybe all kinds of other revealed texts are God, let's say for the moment, godly discourse, divine discourse to various groups of people, because they enable those people to achieve the human good more richly, more fully, more deeply. That is to say that it is true that they are divine discourse. I hope that's not too confusing. Obviously, this is an issue one could go into in much more depth, but I don't mean to say it's useful as opposed to true. I want to say it's ethically powerful and therefore true.
Yeah, thank you very much. We are almost running out of time, less than 2 minutes, but this is very interesting question. The last but not the least question for both speakers, please. If we begin with Dr. Soroush, how can we distinguish between the divines or God's literal speech from hallucination if the experience is so personal and with only one person in the history, with no physical witnesses or evidence, but only historical evidences? How do you distinguish between real and hallucinatory experience of God? Yeah, Dr. Soroush, you first, please.
Well, this takes us to the the evidence for the prophethood or the truthfulness of the prophet. So all I can say is you can now trees by their fruits. So if you want to see if it is hallucination or if it is a real inspiration, look at the fruits, look at the consequences, of the good consequences of Prophet of Islam has been accused of being epileptic, but no epileptic person has ever produced a book like the Quran. So, I mean, don't look at the superficialities and the appearances of things, go deep into the essence, and the fruits tell you what is the tree itself. That's my answer.
Thank you very much. Professor Fleischacker?
My answer would be very similar, I have to say. In fact, I love the metaphor of looking at the fruits. It is said by historical scholars that one of our great prophets, the Jewish prophets, Ezekiel, may in fact have been epileptic or actually not entirely sane. That doesn't matter, I want to say. What matters is whether what he said can be understood as so ethically important, so good, that it is divine, that it is godly. And that's to say, the first measure of whether it's from God or not is how morally acceptable is what it teaches, how morally enriching, how morally illuminating. And that, of course, has to be taken together with some notion of how to interpret it. I mean, if you interpret every word of the Torah literally, it's not so great. But if you take it together with what we Jews call the oral Torah, the tradition of interpreting, as in Maimonides' words, wonders and wisdom can be drawn out of it. If ethical wonders and wisdom, divine wisdom, can be drawn out of what a prophet says, then it is prophecy. And it doesn't matter even if it was a dream or even if it was a hallucination. If what comes out is awful, is evil, is misleading, then it wasn't prophecy, no matter what the prophet thought. So again, I'll just take over Dr. Soroush's terms. You look at the fruits, you look at what it leads us to ethically and theologically, and the source is not that important.
Well, a lot of questions we didn't have time to ask, but thank you very much for your questions. And on behalf of the Islamic Cultural Center of Northern California, I would like to thank Professor Samuel Fleischacker and Professor Abdolkarim Soroush for their intriguing contribution to this debate. I personally enjoyed it a lot and benefit a lot from it, and hope you have the same feeling. And also, I would like to thank the people in the audience, wherever you are, and also those who help us to actually prepare this event and to hold it. If you are interested in this kind of debate series, please stay tuned. Each semester, ICNC have one such debate. It is always free and no registration is needed. In 1 month's time or so, we'll be having another debate about the science and religion conflict. Should there be a conflict between science and religion? One scholar will say yes and the other will say no. So thank you very much, Professor Fleischacker and Professor Soroush. And as we say, Farsi, Khoda nigahdar. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. I'm so grateful to Professor Fleischacker for accepting the invitation. It was very enlightening for me. I'm truly saying and speaking my mind. And
I feel the same way.
We will have more opportunity to meet in person, perhaps. This
Thank you.
speaking was metaphorical. That's was
Very lovely. Thank you. I feel the same way.
indirect. Perhaps indirectly we would want to speak to each other. Thank you so much, and God bless you. Thank you.
You too. You too. God bless you. Thank you. This was great.
Thank you
Bye,
very much.
everybody.
Bye now.
Bye. Khuda Hafiz.
Bye.